Josan, all right, this is a video lecture or a short video to accompany the notes for week 12 or lesson 12 for GFVM 1036 sections 1 and 2. And I will adjust as I go the notes for week 12 or lesson 12 on the Google documents linked from Moodle. So what are we doing here? We're looking at, ancient perspectives on happiness as they relate to the modern world and Eastern and Western perspectives of happiness in dialogue. Ancient meets modern, East meets West. What have we been doing this semester? We've been looking at perspectives on happiness from an interdisciplinary study of things like economics and psychology and their relations to happiness, and then looking at major perspectives from the East and from the West, with an emphasis on philosophy and religions. Aristotle, Kant, Mill, Epicurus, Stoicism, Christian, Western philosophy, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism. Now we're looking at a few interesting bits of conversation between ancient and modern and East and West. And here we are in Hong Kong, where East meets West, as it's sometimes said. And what's the song in the HKBU anthem? Something about Lion Rock, and then East and West unite their best for greater good of all. So there's definitely some of that. And then there's, all the current events in Hong Kong. And this is why I'm in this weird room. I'm in a little kitchen area I was able to get access to where there aren't any children interrupting. And just on the other side of these walls are the children, various children who live nearby. And I don't have the right to occupy their play space to record my lectures. I was able to retreat to the kitchen, and something is making a noise in the background, but we shall do our best. I think it's a refrigerator. These things are still extremely important. And I think if you look for it, you'll find any number of crucial connections between what we're talking about and your own lives, things that are going on in the world. What's that thing I like to say? That passage in the Analects, I think, helps to explain things like Donald Trump and Brexit and other things. All right, what are we doing? East meets West, ancient meets modern. So first, for ancient meets modern, I believe you had a short reading from the Dalai Lama. Let's see if we can go through this material kind of quickly. So who is this guy? The Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism. I believe he's the 14th person to hold this position. He's exiled from Tibet and lives in India. And he's sort of a head of something like a government, the Central Tibetan Administration. I'm really not remotely clear on a lot of details of this particular gentleman's life. I think I may have given you a link earlier to an interesting conversation he had at Emory University in the US. The Dalai Lama representing Buddhism plus some sort of Episcopalian priests representing the Christian tradition, and a Jewish rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs it might have been, and an Islamic philosopher. My brain's freezing. My brain wants to say Nasser. See how do you say Nasser, I believe. There's that. That was an interesting conversation. I hope I gave you the link. I think I gave you the link somewhere. Email me if you don't have it and want it. This particular text, all these background and side comments aside, this particular text is a fascinating analysis of Buddhism and neuroscience. Now, this is fascinating for so many reasons. One reason this is fascinating is we've already seen this with Jeffrey Schwartz. When we talked about psychology and happiness, we looked at what Jeffrey Schwartz says about these matters. Jeffrey Schwartz talks about how the Buddhist practice of mindfulness can help rewire your brain to achieve a better life, to achieve greater happiness, and even to cure obsessive-compulsive disorder. So we've seen some of that. We've seen some of these topics before. Also, why is this fascinating? One reason I find this fascinating is that my dissertation was on Augustine's theology of desire, and I like to make these comparisons and contrasts. We're not happy because we don't have what we desire. What's the solution? Some traditions say, learn to desire God instead. Other traditions say, stop desiring, or desire a lot less. Or they say, beat the world into submission so that it will give us the object of our desire. Now, that attitude was foundational to modern Western science. This was the justification for science given by Descartes and Francis Bacon, these Western philosophers who were supporting science. In a good philosophy of science course, you might never touch them because there's so much to cover in philosophy of science. But in my philosophy of science course, when I've taught it, I think I've taught it twice, not here, I taught it in Pakistan. When I taught philosophy of science, we covered Descartes and Bacon. It's fascinating stuff. And it's an important historical justification of science by its usefulness for changing the world, to bring the world in line with our desires. But Buddhism is the most prominent representative of the tradition of reducing desire to achieve happiness. These seem like opposite approaches. So why is the Dalai Lama, representing Buddhism, giving a speech to a bunch of neuroscientists and saying, hey, Buddhism and science can learn from each other? And he does, and that's interesting and important. That's one reason I find this text fascinating. All right, what else? It is good for modern science. Let's get to our notes. It is good for modern science and ancient religious and moral traditions to interact, to communicate. Thus says the Dalai Lama. Science studies what is, and this can benefit from religious teaching on what is good. What is and what is good are not necessarily the same things. What is and what should be are not necessarily the same things. And science and religion can interact and do a better job figuring these things out. That's some of what's going on here according to this perspective. Neuroscience specifically, and Buddhism specifically, can profit from one another. Neuroscience can tell us how certain practices and behaviors and techniques like mindfulness, like we discussed with Schwartz, can modify the brain. The brain can change based on our behavior, based on how we choose to think. Buddhism can tell us what techniques it has found lead to greater happiness and how that happiness works, what sort of deep satisfaction we take to be the purpose of life and how that is achieved. In that video where he's talking with these other people representing Christianity, Judaism, and Islam at Emory University, he says, our purpose in life is deep satisfaction. How do we achieve that? Buddhism can give its perspective, very old perspective, and it can give us some techniques that lead to this sort of happiness, this sort of satisfaction. And this can give science interesting and useful things to research and help us understand the significance of what science discovers. Meanwhile, science can tell us a lot about how it works. You could maybe have identified some ancient practices that help to modify desire to achieve satisfaction. Great. That's the Buddhist approach from time immemorial, or at any rate, since the Buddha. So what are we talking about here? 3,000, 2,000, maybe 2,500 years ago or something like that. But science can tell us something about how it works by studying scans of the brain and such. That's interesting. Science and ethics don't have to be separate, and they can learn from each other here. Those are some approaches from the Dalai Lama. I'm realizing now I don't have a lot of notes, so maybe we'll do this even more quickly than I was expecting. Let me make another comment on the text that is in my head. There's a popular theory that religion and empiricism are distinct. That empiricism means learning about things from experience, and religion is about dogma and faith. And the Dalai Lama says, no, first of all, Buddhism doesn't even have any dogmas. And second, Buddhism is always about empiricism. It's about learning from experience. If you think religion is contrary to empiricism, that the religious way of trying to achieve knowledge is incompatible with the empirical way of trying to achieve knowledge from experience, that religion and science are different methodologies, you don't understand religion. At least you don't understand Buddhism, because it was always empirical. Even our authorities are supposed to answer to experience. They can be corrected in light of experience. I think you'll find the Dalai Lama says these things if you read this text. Incidentally, off the top of my head, I don't even remember what I gave you. I think I gave you probably a few paragraphs from the text. Maybe I'll just check. Okay, I didn't give you the reading. I gave you a link to the reading, Science at the Crossroads. Okay, so in this text, you will find the Dalai Lama stating that Buddhism is actually a form of empiricism. We're trying to get knowledge from experience, and that means the compatibilities of science and religion understood properly are going to be much more than people often think. If I had time, I could go over some other comparisons I have in my head, and I've written an article about this, which should be published sometime next year, on Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, a Hindu philosopher who says some very similar things, compare and contrast to things said by C.S. Lewis, Christian philosopher, Allama Iqbal, Islamic philosopher, and a Jewish philosopher, Eliezer Berkovitz. There are things like this said about philosophers representing the world's great religions and commenting on empirical aspects of those religions' ways of thinking. This is a thing. I write about this elsewhere. For now, forget about it. Buddhism is empirical according to the Dalai Lama in this text. And he's saying science, neuroscience, and Buddhism coincide a whole lot more than one might think, and Buddhism can help us understand some useful things for science to study. Science can help us understand how this works. And he says some other stuff about science and ethics, like they don't have to be separate, and here are the sort of ethical principles that I think can guide science, etc., etc. Now, looking at your notes, I observe that there are some questions here. Questions like, what if science found a way we could all be happier, but it was a drug? Not like this drug. This is drugs. This is the caffeine drug from tea. Very old practice, Speaking of Buddhist, there's a tea drinking ritual in, Japanese Buddhism? Pardon my ignorance. This is a thing. I can quote the Bible on the propriety of enjoying God's creation with thankfulness. There's that. But what if science found a way we could all be happy? And it was not caffeine. It was a pill. And it's like the pill in Brave New World by Huxley. This pill is called Soma in this book. And it's a happiness pill, and everyone takes it. And it makes for a strange world. And you're supposed to read this book, if you act like most people, if you act like Huxley thought when he was writing the book, no doubt, you're supposed to read this book and be repulsed. You're supposed to think, this is creepy and unnatural. These people are taking pills to be happy. What happened to poetry? What happened to virtue? What happened to everything else that used to give life meaning? What happened to religion and philosophy? Why are these people, what happened to economics and psychology and everything else? Why are these people just substituting pills for genuine happiness? But they think the pills give them genuine happiness, and it seems largely successful. What if science made the pill, discovered the right set of chemicals, and gave us the technology to mass produce the pill, and it was cheaper than M&Ms? I mean, M&Ms are supposed to give us endorphins, right? Endorphins come from, chocolate encourages endorphins or something. I refer to M&Ms sometimes as endorphin pills. I try not to overdo it, but M&Ms are delicious. But what if science had a much more effective endorphin pill? The pill that is cheaper than M&Ms and produces a ton of happiness. Would you take the pill? Should you take the pill? Should we all take the pill? What if the Brave New World scenario were made realistic? Should we take the pill? Or what if science found a way that we could all be a little more happy, but it wasn't a pill. It was actually an ancient religious practice. It was prayer, or it was meditation, or it was repentance from sin, or it was an ancient moral practice. It was Confucian virtue, or Aristotelian virtue, or it was Stoicism's virtues, or even the categorical imperative, or it was following the golden rule. And science confirmed that following the golden rule did things to make us happier, and you could trace them in the brain. Should we do it? And one interesting issue is that so far the happiness pills don't seem to work all that well. We do have pills to fight depression. We have antidepressant pills, and I really think these can be useful. We talked about this already. Remember when we talked about psychology and happiness? I think there is a place for things like antidepressant pills, but antidepressant pills and pills to help us avoid pain can sometimes not be all that helpful. They don't always cure the underlying problem. They don't always lead to long-term happiness, and pills to help us cope with pain sometimes result in horrifying addictions. There are suicide epidemics based on overprescription of these pills. This is a thing. But meanwhile, science has found that Buddhist practices of mindfulness can rewire the brain in ways that lead to greater happiness, according to Jeffrey Schwartz. Again, go back to Psychology and Happiness in week 2 or week 3 of the semester. Wow! So this is interesting. The empirical evidence so far suggests the happiness pills are partially successful, much as happiness drugs have always been. It's not like caffeine's an innovation. This is an old custom. Alcohol is an old custom. This goes back a long way. Happiness drugs, well, they still have some place in life, but they also have never quite given perfect happiness. But meanwhile, some of the old religious and ethical practices taught by things like ancient Buddhist traditions seem to be having some measurable effect that science can support. So it's interesting that there's a fair amount of success in this category and that the Brave New World style happiness pill hasn't happened yet. That's interesting. You might also look at what you could call, the moral perspective. You could look at the practical perspective and the moral perspective. That was the practical. Here's the moral. You might look at the perspective that says it wouldn't be right to take the pill even if it existed. There's that. Or there's not that. Largely the whole point of thinking through someone like the Dalai Lama here, or John Stuart Mill, is that you're not supposed to separate. Or Mencius, what did I talk about last time? Or, I don't know, depending on when you're watching this. If you're at GFVM 2 lectures back, GFVM 1036 section 2, or GFVM 1036 section 1, whatever was our last Friday lecture, I think was Mencius. The whole point of thinking through characters like Mill and Mencius is you're not supposed to separate the practical question from the moral question. They go together. So there's the practical question, which might also be the moral question. Certainly is connected to it. That if what the Dalai Lama and Jeffrey Schwartz are talking about is correct, I'm not an expert here, neuroscience helps to show how ancient religious practices, moral practices, can rewire the brain and make us happier. Wow, that's great. And then there's the other perspective that says, if the happiness pill, like in Brave New World, did exist, it doesn't seem right to take it. There's that. That may also be an issue. All right. I was going to say something else about the pills, wasn't I? Remember, it wasn't the happiness pills. It was this anecdote from my uncle. I think I've already given both units of this course this anecdote. Let's do it again. Long time ago, I wasn't married yet, so 13, 14 years ago, my wife and I are hanging out at my uncle's house because my wife is good friends with my cousin. My uncle comes home from a medical conference in San Antonio. He's a doctor, a specialist in addictive medicine. And at this medical conference, he'd heard a lecture by some scholar about how cutting-edge science is showing how the brain can be modified. So there used to be a theory that the level of intelligence is fixed. If you hit yourself in the head hard enough, you can damage your intelligence, or smoke enough weird things, you can damage your brain and be less intelligent. Otherwise, intelligence is fixed. And my uncle said, no, new research is showing, according to this presentation at the conference, that there are things you can do to become more intelligent. The brain can be molded. This word the Dalai Lama uses in this reading is plasticity. The brain has plasticity, which means it can be changed. You can improve your brain. How do you improve your brain? According to what my uncle heard at the conference, which I interrupt myself to state, I wasn't at the conference. I don't even remember exactly what year it was, but 2007 or 2006 is a good guess. Maybe 2005. No, it was 2006 or 2007, one of the two. Or was I married? If it was 2007, maybe I was already married. Anyway, it was 06 or 07. I haven't been to the conference. I can't confirm much here. This is what my uncle said he learned at a conference, so take it for what it's worth. It's certainly not first-hand knowledge. It's not even second-hand. But anyway, according to this report, these researchers have found that the brain can be modified, it can be improved, intelligence can be increased, and I expect my uncle to say, here are the practices that improve happiness. And then list things like read Shakespeare, read Plato, play Sudoku, play chess, maybe study Latin or study some other languages, study Greek, Russian, French, Swahili, study Japanese or something. And he lists moral and religious practices. These are the things he says. The researchers found increased intelligence, forgiveness, prayer, meditation. it was religious practices that increased intelligence. So that's not nearly as impressive as Schwartz, because it's just me remembering what my uncle said from what he heard at a conference. If you track down the original research, you may find something more interesting. But go with the anecdote for what it's worth, if you like, or don't. Go with what Schwartz and the Dalai Lama are talking about. At least you can track down the sources more easily than my vague memories of 2006 or 2007. Apparently, there's some research showing that the brain can be modified. And so Buddhism, and its a study of it's ancient, it's 2,500-year-old or so, 2,300-year-old study of how moral and spiritual practices can make us happy, can be added to a neuroscientific study of how the brain is modified. This is an important way in which ancient meets modern. And now, partially ancient meets modern, but more East meets West. Du Weiming is a Confucian scholar. He's one of the major figures in contemporary Confucianism. Alas, I've never met him. I've met a few. There are people associated with this, contemporary scholars of Confucianism. Dr. Ruping Fan is at one of our universities in Hong Kong. I always forget which one it is. Let's see, Dr. Kwan at HKBU studies Confucianism. Dr. William Ng studies Confucianism, blah, blah, blah. Dr. Du Weiming, I think incidentally it should be Du with a D in pinyin, but I think his name as it's usually written is using the Wade Giles transliteration scheme, so T. Du Weiming is one of the Confucian philosophers of right now, and he is also a follower of some principles from Enlightenment philosophy. So he thinks human rights are important. He talks about liberty, equality, progress, the dignity of the individual, respect for privacy, government for, by, and of the people, and due process of law. He talks about all these things, and he says these principles of human rights are consistent with Confucian principles. And Confucian principles and human rights principles are universal. Or at least they're universalizable. It's not like Kant was writing a book in moral philosophy, the groundwork for metaphysics and morals, and was thinking, this is for Germans, or this is for Europeans, or this is for cultures where Christianity is the major religion. No, this is for all human beings, he said. It's not like Confucius was meant for just China. These are meant to be universal principles of humanity for all humans. All within the 4 C's are the brothers of the gentleman, he says. And if I went out to the barbarian tribes and taught them these principles, it would work there too, he says. So these are meant to be universal principles, or at least they can be universalized and should be. Does that mean that they should be? Well, according to the traditions, they should be. And should they be? Well, are the traditions correct? Well, at any rate, we can observe there's a lot more consistency. You could go with this theory. You could say that the West emphasizes human rights. There's me, and I've got my rights to do what I want. Dang it, and give me my rights. I want my rights, the Western perspective. And then there's the Eastern perspective, the Confucian perspective, which emphasizes responsibilities. There's me, and I got obligations to my parents, my wife, my kids, my country, blah, 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 blah. Society in general. And there's the Confucian emphasis on responsibility, and the Western emphasis on rights, and Du Weiming is coming along and saying, hey, those two things are consistent. You can have rights and responsibilities. That's not a terrible way of thinking through this. I think it's a bit oversimplified. If you look at Mencius, there's some sort of a concept of the rights of the people. The people have a right to a benevolent ruler, right? That's a theme in Mencius. Now, again, I'm not in a position to say exactly how this compares and contrasts to, for example, John Locke's view of the rights of the people, which is expressed in the American Declaration of Independence. Government exists to protect these rights. I can't state for sure how closely Mencius corresponds to Locke here. That's the sort of thing experts in Mencius need to write books about, and I believe they do. I haven't written them. Honestly, I haven't even read them. But, this is a topic for further study. There's some connection there. And then, Western philosophy, I can answer this one. Modern Enlightenment Western philosophy has a ton of emphasis on responsibilities. Mill says the golden rule is the magnificent summary of what utilitarian ethics teaches. Do to others what you want them to do to you. Love your neighbor as yourself. There are also virtues that need to be practiced in Kant and Mill. And if we didn't have anything else, here's a really big one. We have the categorical imperative. In Kant, the categorical imperative gives us a really heavy responsibility to act properly towards others. So there's plenty of emphasis on responsibilities in Western Enlightenment philosophy, and on at least some emphasis on rights, or something very similar, something coinciding with Western conceptions of rights to some extent in Eastern philosophy. But it's probably safe to say that there's been more of an emphasis on human rights in Western philosophy in the last few hundred years, and traditionally in Confucianism there's been more emphasis on responsibilities. That's true. I think something like that is a better way of thinking through it. There's been more of an emphasis and a divergence of emphasis on these things. But, says Du Weiming, these are consistent principles. And he says Confucianism is a valuable spring of wisdom for an understanding of human rights, broadly conceived. And in fact, I've speculated that you can go further. You can even give something like a metaphysics of rights and responsibilities. If I have a responsibility to my students to, for example, make videos so that in the absence of a face-to-face lecture, they have as many opportunities to learn the material as is necessary, as is sufficient for them to be able to learn the material properly. They can do the readings, they can study the notes I'm making available on Moodle, and they can watch some sort of lecture as a substitute for me talking in class, because, brains work in different ways, and even one brain works in different ways. If you read something, you understand this much, and you remember this much maybe. If you take some notes, you remember maybe this much. You understand, if you take notes, you remember this much and understand this much, maybe, I don't know. If you do some reading and do some notes while listening to a lecture, and then you study the notes later, you'll understand and remember a whole lot more. So I have a responsibility to, in the absence of lectures in class on campus because of Junction Road and and the unavailability of campus right now, because of that, I got responsibilities to do this or do something to substitute for the lectures. Well, if that's true, if I have that responsibility, you, the student, you have a right for me to do that to do that for you. You have a right to expect your teacher to make some reasonable efforts to accommodate to the situation, to give you an alternative to learning in an in-class lecture. And if you have a right, I've also got a responsibility to meet that right. This is a thing you can do. You can argue that rights and responsibilities go together by their very nature. One always entails another. Where one human being has a right from another, the other has a responsibility to act accordingly, and vice versa. You can make that analysis. I don't think Du Weiming does in this text, but it's a plausible analysis. What does he do in this text? Well, he says things like, Western human rights ethics, with its emphasis on individualism and personal liberty, can cause some serious problems. There can be environmental exploitation. There can be social exploitation. There can be Western hegemony. He gives a nice list of some problems. Acquisitive individualism, vicious competitiveness, pernicious relativism, and excessive litigiousness. If you don't know all these words, do what you got to do. I like to double-click, Control-C, Control-T, Control-V, Enter, and then you get a dictionary definition of litigiousness. I won't read it to you. I'll tell you, I believe this word refers to lawsuits. This is a thing in the USA. There are a lot of lawsuits in the USA. People can get sued for all kinds of things. And some lawsuits, I dare say, are necessary. What does Confucius say about this? He says, I think Confucius says, this is almost a quote. He says, the problem isn't that there are lawsuits. The problem is that they were necessary in the first place. I want there to be less of a need for lawsuits, I believe he says. Anyway, Du Weiming's critique is there are too many lawsuits in the West. Too many people freak out over relatively small things, relatively minor infractions of what they fancy to be their rights, and demand justice in the form of a judge making the other guy give them a lot of money. Plus moral relativism, plus vicious competitiveness, acquisitive individualism, environmental problems, social problems, Western hegemony, blah, blah, blah. There's all of these things. And he summarizes it as saying there's a conflict between liberty and equality on the one hand and the lack of concern for the community on the other hand. This is his diagnosis of problems associated with modern Western culture. I interject to say, if you make a careful list of all the things he's doing, based on our notes here, social exploitation, environmental exploitation, Western hegemony, acquisitive individualism, vicious competitiveness, pernicious relativism, excessive litigiousness. If you make a list of all those things, and I went down the list, I might say, check, I agree with that, too many lawsuits in America. X, no, I don't think that's quite phrased right, let me rephrase, or something. I can't promise to agree, and you think through the list yourself if it helps. You might not agree with every detail here, or you might agree with all of them and think, oh, he left out this one. You can check the text, make sure he left it out, but maybe he did leave out some problems. This is a thing. Honestly, if I were to sit down and make my own list, it'd probably look a little different. It might well overlap on some interesting points, but I'd probably come up with my own list of a conflict between liberty and equality and a lack of concern for community, stemming from a cultural focus on rights and a neglect of responsibilities. And incidentally, as I'm saying this, I realize, hey, this is a critique that turns up in the West too. Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue, is telling us modern Western philosophy has led us into confusion. We need to get back to Aristotelian virtue. And there's probably a really cool book someone could write on McIntyre and Dewey Ming, compare and contrast their Confucian critiques of the modern West with their with the Aristotelian critique of the modern West. This is a thing. These are cool topics you can talk about. Dewey Ming is actually surprisingly optimistic. For a Confucian who's critiquing the modern West, he's surprisingly optimistic about the modern West and its philosophy. Human rights are important. The problem is not human rights. The problem was emphasizing human rights without emphasizing responsibilities. Human rights are important, but if you have an overly individualistic Western approach, you're going to botch human rights because you're botching responsibilities. You need to do both if you're going to get either quite right. So the solution is something along these lines. Confucian principles can help. Take these modern ideas that are useful. What was that list we had earlier? Rule of law, due process of law, rule of law. Maybe that's not in his list. He could probably add it. If I made my list, I would have put that there. Liberty, equality, progress, human rights, dignity of the individual, respect for privacy, government for, by, and of the people, due process of law. So there's a nice list. You can take these modern Western conceptions and take some Confucian conceptions about responsibility to family, to society, and put them together. Confucian principles can help. Community and family is important too. Also, don't think that the human being is this individual. Human being is an individual full stop, as just, there's a word, it's monad, M-O-N-A-D. If you like, Control-T, M-O-N-A-D, enter and get a definition of monad. The individual should not be thought of as a social atom. Don't think of the individual as just a self existing independently by himself, carried in himself, all of himself. No, the self is a contextualized being. You exist in community with others. You exist in the context of nature and heaven in Confucian language. So the Enlightenment principles need to be integrated with this understanding of the human being as a contextualized being, as a thing that comes with built-in obligations to family and community. Take human rights, by all means, draw from the West on the subject, but also take responsibilities, draw from Confucianism. It'll really help. And the Enlightenment principle of self-interest must be supplemented by the Confucian negative form of the Golden Rule. And although he doesn't really identify it as a golden rule, he correctly connects this Confucian emphasis. In order to establish ourselves, we must help others to establish themselves. In order to enlarge ourselves, we must help others to enlarge ourselves. So he connects this to the golden rule, though he doesn't quite call it a golden rule. I do. And he says this will help. Take the negative golden rule of Confucius as a minimum way of correcting Western perspectives that emphasize human rights. Good job there. And neglect responsibilities. Bad job there. Confucianism can help. Start with the negative golden rule and then add this positive principle. In order to establish ourselves, we must help others to establish themselves, etc. And in a one-sentence summary, individual rights and responsibilities are inseparable in all domains of human flourishing.